Good day, I'm Khawaja Hammad Akbar.
And I'm Robert Fantina. And you're listening to Geopolitics, exploring myth versus reality. Each week, we interview distinguished experts from around the world to explain and clarify the most pressing international issues of the day.
Our guest today is Matthew Hoh. He is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy and a member of Eisenhower Media Network. He is a 100% disabled Marine combat veteran, and in 2009, he resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest of the escalation of war. He also was the Green Party's candidate for US Senate from North Carolina in the recent midterms elections. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us today.
Hey, thank you both for having me here.
Welcome, Matthew. Okay. Right now, of course, Russia is involved in a war with Ukraine, and the U.S. international community has condemned that, and rightly so. But there is certainly more to it than meets the eye. Would you like to comment, please, on that situation?
Well, it is. It's incredibly tragic. It's the suffering and the cruelty of war is on full display in what's happening in Ukraine, and I think people are getting a good glimpse of it. Where we've had 20 years of censored American warfare, I think the West, and particularly those in the U.S., are now getting an understanding of what warfare is actually like, because the American media is so happy to show the full reality of it, because, of course, it paints Russia in a rightfully very negative light. But this is a war that in Ukraine that many in Washington, D.C., and many in London, and many in Moscow and Kyiv have wanted for a long time. And on the U.S. side, this is a war that has been warned against by many public foreign policy, military, diplomatic, intelligence figures for decades now. But it's also been a war that many have been scheming for, that many have been desirous of, whether they be those in uniform, such as I believe the U.S. Army, that you have generals in the U.S. Army who want to be, they want their opportunity to win their world war. Right. The U.S. Army is coming out of the losses in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were not wars that were anywhere akin to World War II. And so, just as one example of the different factions within Washington, D.C. that would want war, you can see how the U.S. Army wants a war like this because it allows them more armored brigades, more heavy presence in Europe, and also the chance to be generals in line with historical figures like Dwight Eisenhower or George Patton. But certainly it's a war that has been in the making for decades. And I think people are very familiar, or should be very familiar, especially the last 10 years or so that have led to this point. But it really is a criminal, tragic occurrence where there are no good sides. I think that's something that we struggle with here in the U.S. because our conversations are always so binary. Red versus blue. Particularly our political conversations. And so this idea that there might not be a good side, that there are no good actors in this war, that this is a war, in my opinion, that is based upon megalomania and the desire for commerce and fossil fuels, that the only good side is the Ukrainian people that are suffering. And of course, our sympathies as well must extend to the Russian families who are losing thousands of young men and women in this war as well. So it's complex, it's tragic, and it is something that is quite deliberate in its occurrence.
And you mentioned the idea of commerce and power and so on, and that seems certainly to be true with most wars, and certainly most wars that the United States wages. So this is, I think, typical in the U.S. wanting to extend its geopolitical influence around the world, and to strengthen it, and to send a warning to other countries that they dare not defy the United States. Matt, what do you see as the expansion of NATO in the context of a cause of this war?
Oh, I mean, certainly it's a key aspect of this war. It certainly is Russia's prime or one of their prime explanations for the war. And whether or not you agree with it, you have to understand that that is what the Russians believe. And if one of the great shortcomings, if you could describe it that way, it's really more of a factor of arrogance and ignorance and hubris. But from the United States side, this inability to understand how an adversary, how a competitor, how a peer may approach things and their reasons for doing so. And you have seen this continually, particularly through since the end of the Cold War, in one American foreign policy and military operation that has been cruel and disastrous for people, but have benefited the United States in some manner, and then a seemingly inability for the United States to understand why people would oppose it. But in the sense of the expansion of NATO, certainly this is something that was warned about by, as I've mentioned before, many foreign policy, diplomatic, intelligence, military officials, prominent pundits, whether it be George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, the current director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns. I mean, the list of men and women who gave warning about this, who said, if you expand NATO, this will be a red line. It's red line seems to be one of the more favorite phrases in Washington, D.C. circles over the last decade or so. But this will be a red line for Russia. And certainly, you have events that occurred throughout the 90s, throughout the first decade of this century, throughout this last decade, where the Russians clearly made it known that this is, again, a red line. Vladimir Putin said this to George Bush in 2008 directly. If you expand NATO into Ukraine, I will be forced to act. The other aspects of it too, which are so bewildering, or should be bewildering, but when you look at it in the entirety of the American foreign policy establishment and its decision making, is just par for the course. But you see how a government like Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, responds to provocations. Say in its war with Georgia in 2008, against its ally Syria from 2011 on. In both those cases, the Russians are very clear, or say in terms of its war with Chechnya and the way it has handled that for the better part of 3 decades. Why anyone in the West would look at Russia and hear them say, this is a red line, if it is crossed, we will respond. And I believe there was clearly, and I think one of the things that Putin said to George Bush, say in 2008 and Romania, was, we will take Crimea back. So how can you then have this NATO expansion with all these clear and very observable warnings coming from the Russians and not take that seriously unless your intent was to provoke? As well as go along with some of the commerce aspects that we described, because at the end of it, what's the reason for NATO existing after the end of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact? Well, it's for arms sales. And that's one of the things I think people have to look and understand about with this war. You do hear a good amount in both the left and the right in the United States about the amount of money the United States is spending on military assistance to Ukraine, totaling in the tens of billions of dollars, over $50 billion in military assistance alone, in just since February or so. But you also have to then factor in the mass amounts of weapons sales that have occurred all throughout Europe since Russia's invasion in February, and even more so since the U.S. coup and then the start of the Civil War in 2014. You look and you see the number of, say, F-35 jets that have been sold, or various drones, or whatever it is that these European countries are buying. You see like the vast expansion of the German military. The amount of money being made off of this is massive. So we have to understand NATO's role in this as well. It serves both that geopolitical megalomania that we need to control as much of the map as possible, as if some game of real life risk, as well as the commerce side, where the more nations we have in NATO, the more weapons we can sell. The more of a threat that Russia is, the more weapons we can sell. And, of course, those things reinforce each other. And it's very difficult to say this is the prime cause when they are so intertwined.
Thank you, Matthew. You covered rightly the expansion of NATO and the apprehensions given by the voices of sanity. But here comes very particular question that the relationship of European Union, particularly with the United States, and how it has impacted by the Ukraine and Russia conflict. And the second point in this, the future of Ukraine and Russia conflict, how it has impacted the security operators of Europe.
You asked about
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because America is committed to help his allied member countries. So if the war expands, if the Ukraine-Russia conflict crosses the borders of Ukraine or reaches to Eastern European countries, how you see that probability in future?
Well, I think that's something that's very scary. This idea, the expansion of the war, and we've seen that. We've seen the war expand, as all wars do. And it comes back to this basic understanding of escalation, that you view escalation as a ladder. You can escalate up or you can escalate down, right? You can't escalate horizontally. So for in a very type of physics type of Newtonian laws type of understanding, every action results in an equal and opposite action. So you can look at now what's happening with Russia's attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, including energy. And as the weather is as it's wintertime, this is critical, and this is going to cause a lot of people to lose their lives, and it's going to be horrendous. Well, you also have to look at the fact that Russia did not really attack in any large scale or meaningful way, really, Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, until the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed and the Kerch Bridge was attacked. I mean, so you can see how Russia responds in kind to escalation as any belligerent would. And this Ukraine does the same. So as Ukraine suffers attacks from Russia, it launches attacks of its own. And so again, where to say who started this, I don't know where to set that arbitrary date in history. You could go back, depending on who you talk to, you can go back hundreds of years to try and to get the precursor or the antecedent or the precedent for each of these events. And certainly, I think that's one of the things that's really difficult about this conversation here in the United States, is because, say, much like the American war in Afghanistan, which really begins in the late 1970s, in the United States, discourse of the war in Afghanistan in the last 20 years is strictly all begins with the 9/11 attacks. And anything before that is a historical reference that's really a historical context, or it doesn't have the significance that needs to be included in this conversation. And it really is quite maddening, because as we all know, that's not how life in the world and history actually work. So, but we're seeing this danger of escalation. And certainly a few weeks ago, when an errant Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Poland, there was quite a rush to proclaim that Russia had attacked Poland, and this was an escalation of the war, and NATO must respond. And you saw this from European circles, you saw this from United States circles, and you saw this from media circles. And thankfully, cooler, wiser heads prevailed. I don't publicly compliment Joe Biden very often, but I will compliment him for so quickly putting down this idea that Russia had attacked Poland, because there was already within not even hours, within minutes of this attack occurring, there was a buildup, there was an excitement and enthusiasm for further war. oh, here we go, NATO's going to do Article 5, and you could feel the desire for that among the American neoconservative and liberal interventionist classes that define both the Democratic and Republican Party. You could see that within Congress, and you could see that within the United States media as well, this desire for more war. So the problem with it is twofold. One, you have the very real occurrence that wars escalate, wars get out of control, that wars are uncontrollable forces of nature that are breeding grounds for unintended consequences. And I'm sure if you have any familiarity with any war, people get that, right? But then the other side of that is that people are desirous for more war. Again, this is a war in Ukraine that many in Washington, D.C., many in London, many in Kyiv, many in Moscow have wanted for a very long time. And a further war, a showdown, say, between the West and Russia is again something that many want. And the reality of that is quite palpable.
Matthew, to conclude this, I will just ask you to briefly comment on the Biden administration's policy towards Russia, how they are actually planning to develop their relationship with Russia. Is there any plan in existence?
No, I don't think there's a plan. I don't. I think there's an antagonistic relationship. They severely miscalculated. One, I think they honestly believe that Russia would back down, that Vladimir Putin's government would not respond as they did, whether it be the 2014 coup in Ukraine, that was at the very least American supported, if not American led. But then too, that Russia would also back down from increasing provocations within Ukraine, including increased fighting in the Donbass region, which begins in spring of 2021. You have increased violence there. And again, this is a Russian government that we saw their responses in Chechnya, we saw their responses with Georgia, we saw their responses in Syria. Why would we think that they were bluffing? When Vladimir Putin says to his generals, we have nowhere left to retreat to, why would you think a man like that, with everything we know about him and his government, why would we think that they would not push back? And so certainly, I don't think the Americans have had a plan that is realistic or that is thought out past step one and step two. And the same goes with their economic policy. These sanctions have proven to be effectively useless. In many ways, people will say they've actually strengthened the Russian economy. The Russian dollar is at its strongest point it's been in years. And certainly you've seen this development of increased relationship between Russia and China, Russia and India, Russia and Iran, Russia and Venezuela, Russia and other, as well as the fact that the vast majority of people in this world, if you break it out by population, the vast majority of people in this world don't support the American sanctions against Russia, which is completely, which seems ludicrous here in the United States because our media is so propagandized about this war. But to those in other parts of the world, seeing American performance, American brutality in its foreign policy, and then seeing Russia, I think many people throughout the world are not eager at all to support the Americans in this. So the Americans don't really have a strategy because their desire to see Russia back down failed. The economic sanctions have simply not worked and may be counterproductive in many ways. And then I think that the danger is that the overall strategy with Ukraine is that you suck Russia into a war in Ukraine. And this is something that was roundly said at the beginning of 2022 when this invasion was occurring, that this would be Vladimir Putin's Afghanistan. The idea being that Russia would be sucked into this invasion, this occupation. They would become exhausted. The government would be overwhelmed. The people would turn against the government, and that the Vladimir Putin government would fall. I think it's much more likely that you would see Volodymyr Zelensky's government fall in the next couple of years than you will see Vladimir Putin's government fall. And this is a calculation that I don't think the American government has made at all, but rather this Pollyannish view that because a very Pollyannish view, a very view that this will work out because we are the Americans and we are good. I mean, that I know that's overly simple, but that is how many people in Washington, D.C. See things. It's also also indicative of the desire for greed, the commerce. I mean, one of the things that really fuels this war that people really don't understand is liquid natural gas and the amount of LNG that the United States has exported to Europe over this last year has made many in the U.S. even wealthier than they were. I mean, this has been a great boon to the American fossil fuel industry, and that was part of this plan all along. And many, including myself, believe that the Obama administration turn against Russia in 2013 or so was heavily predicated on this desire to split Europe, particularly Western Europe, away from its fossil fuel resources or sources in Russia and receive them instead from the United States.
Okay, Matt, thank you. You made a couple of points I just want to reiterate. When the rocket that landed in Poland that was actually sent from Ukraine, that people said was from Russia, it's reminiscent of the Gulf of Tonkin. Luckily, It didn't have the same result. When in that case, the U.S. accused North Vietnam of attacking, and it hadn't actually, but it did cause the war to escalate. That was one fortunate thing about this, anyway. And you mentioned that the U.S. thought Russia would back down, and yet the U.S. has never, its sanctions, its other policies against Cuba, for example, which is going on for decades now, thinking that it's going to bring some regime change, and it hasn't. It's only strengthened the people there. And the U.S., you also mentioned, hasn't thought this through, doesn't have a plan. That also seems to be typical of the U.S., which just has a might makes right belief, and their bombs will resolve the issues, whatever those might be. The U.S. government and government officials don't seem to be able to learn from history, from their own mistakes.
Right, and I'm reminded of what Cornell, the U.S. philosopher Cornell West says. He describes American society as being at the intersection of might makes right and greed is good. And certainly, I think if you look at the war in Ukraine, as well as American warfare throughout this century, and going back centuries before, but this idea that might makes right and greed is good weighs throughout. America's foreign policy as well, but its domestic policies, and that is, I think, the crux of colonialism and imperialism is this might makes right combined with greed is good. One enables the other. And you look at the American policy towards Ukraine, but throughout the world, against China, say against Cuba, as you just brought up, but all throughout the Muslim world, this desire for wealth that is backed up by hubris, so the desire to continually extract, as well as the desire to make sure everyone is underneath the American flag. So it certainly, that's I think a point to be understood as to how can people get to this point where they think that this is going to work? How can they look and think, well, this is not going to happen like it happened before? The examples you brought up. I mean, when has any nation backed down? When has any of these policies actually achieved their stated results or stated objectives? And so you just keep coming back to, well, it's the culture, it's the actual people, it's it's who the American government is, as well as the fact that it is an empire. And so, might makes right and greed is good are the two underlying motifs.
The complete disregard of human rights or international law.
Right. Yeah, I mean, those things are not important. I mean, they're important as a fabricated storyline. They're important as some form of motto. They're important for public relations. So certainly you will see, say with Russia, where the United States government will criticize Russia for its actions against the LGBTQ community in Russia, which certainly should be condemned. At the same time, too, of the 10 nations in the world that have death penalties for homosexuality, the United States provides weapons and military assistance to 7 of them. So there's a great hypocrisy that exists within the American stated objectives of human rights, peace, liberty, democracy, what have you. I mean, those are nothing more than I mean, that's nothing more. Those are just basically lies, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Right. The U.S. government officials are condemning what's going on in Iran right now, and yet they continue to support the same kinds of atrocities that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people. So the hypocrisy is very strong and very obvious.
Exactly. And I think Iran is such a great example because you literally could take that Persian Gulf and fold it in half and have Iran, the Iran fold over and meet Saudi Arabia. I mean, in a sense that just across that body of water is, one of the 3 or 4 strongest, well, I don't know if you would describe them strongest. Certainly there's been a rift in American-Saudi relations over the last several years. But in terms of American commitment to Saudi Arabia, that's not that's not debatable at all, as well as the continued protection of Saudi Arabia by the United States. So, say just recently, Joe Biden's making sure that Mohammed bin Salman's, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, having immunity from being prosecuted for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But also, too, as you said, then you just go a little farther west, and the great hypocrisy of the American support for Israel against the Palestinians. Go a little farther west, the great hypocrisy of the American support for the Egyptian government, and so on and so on. I looked into this last year, about a year or so ago. I published just a short piece based upon the work that had been done by others before, like David Swanson and others. But, just wanted to make sure the numbers were up to date. And sure enough, of the nations listed by Freedom House, which is a very conservative think tank in the United States dedicated to the American project, if you will. That's what they like to call it, right? So very neoconservative. But of the nations that they list as not free nations, so the dictatorships, the military regimes, the autocracies, etc., 74% of them receive support from the United States militarily. So, I mean, you have nearly 3/4 of the world's monarchs, dictators, autocracies, military regimes, etc., are supported by the United States militarily. I mean, so it is. It is a great farce. It's a great lie. And of course, the end result of that is mass suffering while, people make a lot of money and other people are kept in power.
Yes. Now, Matt, you mentioned Saudi Arabia a moment ago, and Saudi Arabia and China have recently increased their alliance, and U.S. policy seems to be pushing them closer together. You mentioned there have been some rifts between the U.S.-Saudi Arabia alliance. How do you see that impacting U.S. foreign policy in that area of the world?
Well, I think you need to understand the U.S. and Saudi relationship as, of course, being a very transactional one. Certainly never built upon principles. And as long as the transactions were equal to one another, things would go fine. But once one got more leverage over the other, which is which in the case of, say, Saudi Arabia and the United States now, Saudi Arabia has this leverage, and it has, since, of course, I was born in 1973, so the midst of the first oil crisis, right? I mean, but certainly, not unknown to the United States population, this ability for nations like Saudi Arabia to bring economically and politically to its knees the United States, because the United States, if you look at it, and if you understand the United States, cheap gasoline prices are the driver of so many things. So many things in this country, our economy, our society, our community infrastructure, everything in the United States is built around the car or the truck. The need, the ability of Saudi Arabia to thus have this leverage over the United States has been well known. But in the last decade or so, as Saudi Arabia as their abuses have become more wide known, as say such a thing as the war in Yemen, which is a genocide, and nearly 500,000 Yemenis have been killed, and quite just a horrific war, completely supported by the United States. As these things have become better understood and seen, there's been more in the United States speaking out against Saudi Arabia, and that has offended the Saudis. And so the Saudis, I believe, like to ensure that the United States knows that they can, by turning the oil valve up or down, can bring the United States to its knees. And certainly you saw this happen in this last year, whereas a number of things, including the war in Ukraine, the cost of oil spiked, and so the cost of gasoline went up tremendously in the United States, and that caused great political harm for the Democrats. And Joe Biden, to his political credit, was wise enough. I mean, I don't agree with this, but he was wise enough politically to release 50 million barrels of oil in the United States from the United States' domestic oil reserve, and that brought down, among other things, but it was one of the chief reasons why gasoline prices did go back down in the United States, and why the Democrats weren't beaten so badly in the midterm elections as many people expected them to be. But so you can see how the crown prince of Saudi Arabia has this type of control over the American president. And so that type of this relationship has gotten stressed. And I think as the Saudis understand their power, and I think as a person like MBS, the crown prince, comes into his own, and as he gains more and more control, and it seems as if he's had control for quite a while, but he's not his father, and he's not his grandfather, he's not his family. I mean, he wants to assert Saudi Arabia in a way that meets his own ambition. And I don't think he's happy being a client state of the United States as other generations of his family were. He perhaps doesn't see the danger. He doesn't come from their own perspective. He didn't, grow up or was the first generation born after the creation of Saudi Arabia as a modern nation. I mean, so all those things. He's certainly didn't live through the trials of the late 1970s in Saudi Arabia. So I think he's more secure in who he is, what he wants his country to be. And he doesn't feel the need to remain tied to the Americans, particularly as the Americans, the United States is not a prime importer of Saudi oil. So, he certainly, I think, is ambitious enough, and he is clever enough to see that there are other options for him out there. And that just because, even though the United States does not import a lot of Saudi oil anymore, but it's still the United States lives and dies on the price of oil. And so whether or not the United States imports Saudi oil or not is completely irrelevant, because as long as the Saudis are the main producers of the world, they control the price of oil. And because the Americans are so tied to the price of oil, they are ultimately dependent upon the Saudis. And I think also, too, the Saudis have seen the American greed. They know that all they have to do is line up to buy a couple $100 billion in U.S. weapon sales, and the Americans will fall back in line. So a lot of this is the United States have painted itself into a corner with Saudi Arabia by having this transactional relationship, by not following any principles, by allowing Saudi Arabia to get away with mass human rights crimes like it does so many other nations. But then too, also being so transparent in its, hey, if you're willing to buy tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons, we will do whatever is needed to ensure those sales go through, because we don't want you buying them from the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, et cetera. So, I mean, as well as too, the American, imagine if the United States had an energy policy going back decades now that had been a policy devoted to ensuring clean, renewable energy. The United States then at this point would be insulated from oil prices and would not have to have this relationship with Saudi Arabia, where the leverage is clearly so in Saudi's favor.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. That's rightly pointed out about the U.S. commitment to Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia has understood the US foreign policy, and they know how to exploit them. But you also mentioned about the President Joe Biden's decision of not persecuting Mohammed bin Salman on Jamal Khashoggi's murder. But we have witnessed some harsh exchange between Saudi and American officials, and after that, we witnessed a meeting between MBS Mohammed bin Salman and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Yeah, in these two incidents, can we establish any kind of link?
Oh, I think both Saudi Arabia and China have very clear goals, very clear ideas of where they want their nation to go in the next decades. Certainly, I think they see each other as being insulated from domestic policies or domestic politics. So the Saudis know that the Chinese are not going to be concerned about the war in Yemen. They're not going to be concerned about them murdering journalists. They're not going to be concerned about them imprisoning and executing Shia activists. They're not going to be concerned about those things. And the Chinese know the same about the Saudis. That the Saudi, right? I mean, so and that's one of the things that's so inane about the American policies is that we have this window dressing or facade about concern for human rights that gets expressed through the media or from members of Congress or through NGOs, while the American government policy does nothing about it. So you have this hubbub that's created by the United States about human rights, which causes insecurity, humiliation, anger in nations like Saudi Arabia or China, particularly when they look at the United States and says, you all have your own human rights crimes. I mean, what you do at your southern border is a crime against humanity. You have the largest prison population in the world. You have an ongoing genocide against your indigenous people. I mean, so certainly they see the hypocrisy of it all. But I think Saudi Arabia and China see themselves as partners that are reliable partners, that are not going to be subject to shifts in political changes, you're not going to be having to deal with leadership like you see in the United States Congress or in the White House. So you have more of a firm hand and you know where it's going. I think the Saudis and the Chinese both value that, knowing that the deal they strike now with one another in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years will still be honored. I think there's also, too, the Saudis have a very real interest in developing their country. I think they understand that at some point they will not have their oil fortune and that they will have to be a nation that needs to be remade. And in many cases, I believe they are starting to do that. And they are meeting with a China that has seen economic development throughout the world as a benefit to itself. I just heard this the other day. I'm not sure of the provenance of the source of it, but supposedly an African leader or official, again, I'm not sure of the source, said something along the lines of, when the Americans show up, they give you a lecture. When the Chinese show up, you get a hospital. I mean, so I think there's too this understanding of what are the experiences. And, for the Saudis looking forward and saying, okay, we have to develop, we have to reimagine and rebuild our economy and our infrastructure, because right now, sure, Aramco, the Saudi oil company, is by far the largest company in the world. But in 30 years' time, that may not be the case. And the Chinese the same way too. They have their pressures. They certainly have their internal issues, but they also have developed their economy in a way that they know is not sustainable to maintain a status quo. And so they have to further develop. Look, if what is true about China is that they brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into the middle class, that's not something that stays as a stasis. You have to continue to grow your economy and develop your economy, in order to meet the needs of this middle class of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And so they have to find reliable partners throughout the world for their own economic security and well-being. So I think what you're seeing in that type of relationship is also too, you've also got the United States pushing relationships like this. You know, I mean, a friend of mine who knows this stuff much better than I do, but he'll talk about how you had the idea that Tehran and Moscow are such bosom buddies now, such seeming allies, when for centuries the two nations were marked by hostility towards one another. You know, as he says, only the United States government could create such an alliance. And you have this around the world where nations, I think, they see other nations as reliable partners, particularly when they are faced with a belligerent United States. And I mean, certainly in the Chinese case, if the Chinese they read what the American members of Congress who somewhat oppose the war in Ukraine, in the Republican Party say, they see right through that. And basically what these people are saying is that war against Russia is the wrong war. The right war is war against China. And so the Chinese certainly understand that. And so I think American policy is creating these alliances that, may have resulted anyway, but certainly are being given an impetus that is necessitated by the urgency of the threat they feel from the United States, or if not outright threat, then the instability that American military, political, and economic decision-making is replete with.
Robert, you are mute. Kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Matt. And just a quick comment. You mentioned a moment ago that one of the things that China and Saudi Arabia have in common, or that they will do, they can rely on each other to maintain their international commitments. We have the recent evidence of the United States not doing that with its violation of the JCPOA, which is a very significant and important agreement, and the United States just walked away from it. So I think that's one of the things that is also that regardless of what you think of their agreements, China and Saudi Arabia, those governments can rely on each other to maintain them.
Well, exactly. And we saw that with the United States with its arms treaties with Russia, whether it be the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the fact that the New START Treaty was barely extended. And all along, the Russians were willing to extend these things. Of course, in the United States, you hear that the Russians weren't, but that's complete nonsense, the continuation of lies about these things. And it's so... I mean, that's a different issue, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I mean, basically, I think what it is for many nations is that it's not so much maybe this. It isn't. There's an instability. There's a willingness to walk away from an accepted deal. Certainly, you saw this happen in Afghanistan with the Taliban, where for 18 months the Taliban did not attack American forces or Western forces. They were honoring their agreement. The United States failed to remove its forces by May 1st, and so the Taliban, as a result of that, as the Taliban have clearly said, you failed to honor the agreement. You still have troops here. It's May 1st. We are now going to win the war on our own terms. And they did. 3 months later, 4 months later, they were victorious. I mean, so you see that even, where as well as I think where many people will rightly or wrongly look at what happened in Afghanistan and say, wow, the Americans betrayed their allies. They walked away from them. Right. Again, rightly or wrongly, I think many people will look at that and have that feeling. And so I think nations around the world see that. So it's that. Excuse me. But then it's also, too, the fact that you can't trust the American government because everything it says is so duplicitous. So and the question for you as a nation is that, do you want to be a client of the United States, or do you want to be a sanctionee? Do you want to be sanctioned by the United States? That's one of the things interesting about looking at that list of dictators and military regimes and autocracies and monarchs that, the United States provides weapons and military assistance to. The ones that they don't are heavily sanctioned. Those 10 nations that have the death penalty for homosexuality, 7 of which, again, the United States provides military and weapons to. The other 3 nations, it's Iran. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on who those nations are now. But the 3 nations, they're all nations that are sanctioned by the United States. So either you are buying American weapons or you are being sanctioned by the United States. It's one or the other. So I think many nations, many leaders rightly bristle at that and say, I don't want to be a client and I don't want to be an enemy. I don't mean, so either my choice is to buy your weapons, agree to your IMF and World Bank loan terms, enter into austerity economics at the behest of the American system, or be destroyed economically. My people won't be able to get medicine. My people won't be able to import food, on and on and on. I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think you can look at those things and just say, the United States has created a reality of its own making that has caused, not in its quest for hegemony, it has created a bipolar world of us versus them in the American terms that is continually unraveling, becoming more dangerous, and I think is ultimately going to lead to catastrophe.
Thank you. I'll just jump to our next question. You mentioned about the U.S. commitment and the nature of U.S. foreign policy towards the smaller or the developing countries, especially located in Middle East. And it seemed like there was a commitment long stretched on decades with respect to Afghanistan. But in 2019, after the Doha Agreement, the U.S. abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan was by the scholars from all the globe, and now how you see US is handling Afghanistan, its Afghanistan policy, why they left abruptly, and after that they are not actually giving clear statements, clear stances that what is the stance of current American regime towards the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan or Taliban or the Kabul regime now.
Oh, I don't think there is a clear policy. I think the policy in terms as it exists now, with the sanction and the freezing of assets and the unwillingness to talk to the Taliban, is motivated by American domestic political concerns. That if the White House does such a thing, the Republicans will attack them for talking to the Taliban, for betraying all the American soldiers that died over there, for forgetting about 9/11, et cetera, even though it was their own president that finally opened up negotiations with the Taliban, negotiations that should have occurred as soon as the United States invaded in 2001. And there's a host of opportunities all throughout the first decade of the century. I think the ability to negotiate with the Taliban more or less ends with the Afghan surge, as it was called, by the escalation by the Obama administration in 2009. I think at that point, any ability to negotiate was not going to work until you get to a point where you have someone like Trump come in, attempt to negotiate, and you get a deal that, in my opinion, was never going to be. It was never going to be able to be fully realized in terms of bringing about a negotiated settlement that would deliver ceasefires, power sharing agreements, restructuring of the Afghan government, some type of process to undo the harms of the 4 decades of war in Afghanistan. I think you had many in the United States who viewed Afghanistan as remaining an outpost for the American intelligence community and military for decades to come. The idea being that if the United States just continues to spend enough money in Afghanistan, the United States spent $300 million a day in Afghanistan for 20 years, that the United States did such a thing, that the house of cards that it had created in the Afghan government would remain standing. And I think that might have been a possibility. And so my understanding as what they wanted, what was desired to happen, was that there would be this ongoing war against the Taliban in Afghanistan that would be controlled by the Afghan government with the support of American special operations and air power, as well as American contractors, in the CIA, of course, and that it would be, a border war, an outpost war, a colonial war, if you will. And this way, the American army could focus on fighting Russia in Europe, and the Navy and the Air Force could focus on fighting China in the Pacific. And, everyone would everyone within the Pentagon would have their own war. And I believe that one of the reasons why negotiations never really proceeded fully from the Afghan government side was because the Afghan government, I believe, was told over and over again by American military officers, American diplomats, American intelligence officers, that the United States is not really leaving, that don't worry about Trump. He's going to lose the election. Joe Biden will come in. We'll ignore whatever Trump had done. We'll keep sending you money. That will keep you in power. And, we'll make sure you get what you need in order to keep the Taliban at bay. And I believe that is what the Ghani government was told repeatedly by American officials, both in uniform and out of uniform. And that contributed to the Ghani's government inability to fully understand the strength of the Taliban insurgency. So as well as their disregard for that strength, as well as their disregard for how the population had come to view both the insurgency, the war, and the government. And one of the things that's so interesting to me about all this is the Taliban, which is as people know, is primarily a Pashtun movement. I mean, it had its roots, strength, its base within the Pashtun provinces of Afghanistan, and its membership was overwhelmingly Pashtun, on and on and on and on. And the first provinces to fall to the Taliban in 2021 are non-Pashtun provinces. And so where so many commentators in the West who are looking at this are saying, well, the particularly in the North, they're going to put up a great fight against the Taliban. You didn't see that. You didn't see people they weren't coming out in the streets cheering the Taliban, but they weren't standing in their way, because what they had come to their lives had been dominated by a predatory kleptocracy, run by warlords and drug lords. And so what was a return of the Taliban for them was not as bad as their current situation. I mean, and I think that was failed to be understood by the West, by the United States, by the Afghan government, because it was so blinded by its own hubris, its own megalomania. And, so as going forward, I think there's still the same lack of understanding of what's occurring in Afghanistan. I think there's a complete lack of plan. There's no strategy, and whatever there is dominated fully by a fear that somehow Afghanistan will be used for domestic political reasons. Again, you're forgetting 9/11, you're dishonoring the troops who died there, you're weak on terror, et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, and I think what I think most people in positions of power in Washington, D.C. want most from Afghanistan is for it not to be heard of. And we have a very pliant and complying media here in the United States that is certainly doing that, because particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, American media has said almost nothing about Afghanistan, which is even less than what they usually say.
Yeah,
you mentioned clearly about the Trump administration's radical decisions, or a radical move to the radical way they conducted dialogue with the Taliban. But in the same Trump regime conducted another radical move of naming Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and encourage alliances in the region, against the China. So how you see that radical moves of Trump administration and these initiatives of Trump administration, how they are challenging for the Biden administration, because there is no coherence between the moves they made during the previous presidency era and this presidency area. How you gonna comment? Because I got confused whenever I have to talk about this region, Asia Pacific, or I should call it Indo Pacific, because it is a change of name. But it certainly do have implications in documentations. What do you say about this?
Well, the Trump administration was continuing on from the Obama administration. You know, in 2012, the Obama administration put out their defense planning guidance, which comes out with a quadrennial review. It's a once in every 4 years. The Pentagon puts forward, this is how we see the world, and this is what we're going to do about it. And in that document in 2012, very clearly, the Obama administration, its Pentagon, said, we are shifting our focus to China. We are getting out of Afghanistan. We got out of Iraq. We don't want to do these wars in the Muslim world anymore. And what they really were saying was, we're going to turn them over to the special operations community and the CIA, to proxy forces, to contractors, to mercenaries. Let them handle these ugly wars. Again, the Army wants to fight in Europe because we can have tanks and armored vehicles, and we could be like George Patton. The Navy wants to fight in the Pacific because they want to be Leahy or Nimitz or Spruance or any of these, famous admirals from American history. So in 2012, you see the Obama administration say, and that was the Asia pivot, as it was described. And you saw a removal of resources from the United States Central Command, which is the warfighting organization for the Pentagon that covers the greater Middle East, including Pakistan, and to Pacific Command. And then in the Trump administration changed the name to Indo-Pacific. Because I think they want to sell more weapons to the Indians, and they want the Indians to know that they are a priority. And they see India as a hedge, a tool, an ally, if you will, though the Americans never really view anyone as allies. They view them as clients. So as against the Chinese. And certainly there is that history of conflict, between China and India. And the Americans seek to exploit that. But again, the Obama administration was really following on from the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and to a degree, the Clinton administration. I mean, certainly, if people recall, in 2001, when the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration comes into office, and his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, is asked, what are the priorities for the United States? Who are our threats? What do we have to worry about? She says, China, 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 So, and the same thing too, we have to recall Bill Clinton's administration's, their military approach towards Taiwan and China. Bill Clinton famously sailing aircraft carriers up to China's coastlines in the mid-90s. I look at that and I point to that, and you want to understand why China is building out its military. How would you like aircraft carriers, coming up to your coastline and humiliating you? You can only make warnings so often before you have to start laying keels down for ships. I think what you've seen is just a continuation of this policy focused on China, not on India per se, other than utilizing India as a source for weapon sales, because India buys a massive amount of weapons. I can't remember where they are in the world, but they are in the top 5 for weapons purchases. So they have a massive market for that as well. Then too, they have a massive market for oil and energy, which as the United States becomes more and more of an exporter of oil and gas due to fracking, India is a market, but then as well too, this idea, there is an American philosopher in the 1950s. His name was C. Wright Mills. And he was really one of the first people to really take on the American establishment, the American foreign policy, the lunacy of the Cold War, the madness of it. And what he described the United States foreign policy thinkers as, the leaders, the pundits, the diplomats, the politicians, the media people, he described them as crackpot realists. And that's what you have here too as well. You have crackpot realists who look at the map, and because there's been this tension, these conflicts between China, the desire is, oh, we can use China against, we can use India against China. You know, I mean, this is, you know, ultimately it all comes down to how many more aircraft carriers can the United States justify building at $15 billion per aircraft carrier? Well, you need a threat like China to do that. And if you, I mean, as you build all that up, you start playing these games in your heads, these hegemony games, these games of risk in your head, trying to make the world map your color. And you have these crackpot realists who think that, okay, what we will do is we will manipulate India for our purposes against China. We'll sell them some weapons, on and on and on. We can also maybe use them to pressure the Pakistanis to do what we want, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it really is. It's madness, and it's a realm, and it's a reality filled with crackpot realists.
Matt, thank you for that. Thank you for all your comments today. This has been a very interesting and informative discussion about some of the major events and trends that we're seeing in the world today. So on behalf of myself and Khawaja, thank you for your time, for your expertise. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Hey, thank you both. I appreciate this, and happy to do it anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving a method to the madness of United States foreign policy.
I think the madness is the method. It really is. I mean, there's certainly some guiding principles, like might makes right and greed is good. And, you know, certainly I think you can delineate the two main substructures of greed and megalomania. And I don't think you can divorce the two. But I you know, from there you can pull apart different factions within American foreign policy decision making. But yeah, certainly it's depravity, it's cruelty, it's idiocy. It just continues to expound, basically.
And unfortunately, we don't see an end of it in sight.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. But I mean, again, I think there are a lot of things that are occurring that, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, but there is this real turn against, I mean, the American empire, while certainly the American economy is massive, and whether it's the first or the second largest in the world now is debatable what metric you want to use to compare it to China. But certainly the American policies overseas are not economic in nature, but military in nature. And that has caused tremendous problems for many nations, and other nations may look at it and say, well, when's our turn for that? So I think you're seeing these alliances, as well as, you know, whether they be military or diplomatic or economic. But, you know, certainly I think one thing we didn't get into, we could have, was maybe another time, this relationship between China and Saudi Arabia, the monetary relationship, the idea that will the petrodollar be dissolved, you know, and how will that then affect American hegemony, because America is, you know, America's success in the world is dependent upon the American dollar being the world's reserve currency. You take the petrodollar out of the equation, it doesn't collapse it, but it certainly weakens it. You know, so you know, definitely I think there are things that are occurring that I don't see the United States responding to in a manner that will keep itself out of trouble. I see the United States is going to choose to enact policies and make decisions that will exasperate these issues, as opposed to saying, hey, you know what, we have an issue here. We're dependent upon having the world's reserve currency. We're seeing a lot of nations are fed up with that. They don't want to be a client anymore. They don't want to be tied to the American dollar. Saudis are cool now with selling the Chinese oil we want. I mean, like, on and on and on. I mean, as that grows, where does that go? I don't see any decision-making process in the United States that says, okay, how do we intercept that? How do we cut that off? How do we change that? How do we ameliorate it? How do we do anything other than exasperate it? I think you'll just have indignancy from the Americans, and then a return to their principles of might makes right and greed is good.
Yeah, the underlying principles that guide their policies.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, again, Matt, thank you very much for your time and for your expertise. It's greatly appreciated, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate it. You all have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Thank you, audience. See you soon with a good expert and a good discussion for you. We'll be looking forward to our next episode.